The challenge of every student of history is really, how do you separate fact from fiction? Fiction is all over the place and tends to form a part of a national lore. And in our national lore, one of the great sources of fiction is the childhood of George Washington. When I was a little boy, I learned that George Washington couldn't tell a lie. Well, I know enough about Washington now that he could stretch it now and then when it was necessary. I also learned that he would organize the boys at school and only to do good things and would get organized in military formations so they could defend the country. Various things like that. These stories were made up, actually, by a gentleman by the name of Parson Mason Weems, and they form part of the lore of the country. You know, Papa, Papa, I can't tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree. And it's all legend. It's not made up. I mean, it is made up. Well, just let me start over again here, because these legends are made up, and somehow we tend to believe them. Now, there's a parallel figure in the Revolution to George Washington. If Washington represents what we might describe as the virtuous side of the Revolution, the person who gave his all, short of life itself, to support the American cause, that would be George Washington, the model, the ideal citizen. And then on the other side of the equation, or the revolution as a morality play, we have another individual. His name is Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold is a name that will live in infamy. Few have good things to say about him. In fact, if you don't like somebody or what somebody's policies are, or that you don't like what they're doing, you say, well, you're just another Benedict Arnold. It's part of our culture. And just as stories were made up about Washington's childhood as the man of virtue, stories were made up about Arnold as the essence of corruption and vice in the Revolution. And you see, as people look backward through time in the life of Benedict Arnold, which obviously is well known as the man who committed treason and sold out the American cause during the Revolutionary period. That's the modern conception of him. And that started at the time, that individuals then say, well, how can you explain how this man dare sell out this glorious American cause? And there was a historian in the early 19th century by the name of Jared Sparks, went on to be the president of Harvard College, as a matter of fact, did a lot of publishing. He wrote the first biography of Benedict Arnold. And in this biography, he told stories about Arnold's childhood. These stories actually were a product of an early form of what we would call today oral history. Sparks wrote individuals in the town of New Haven, Connecticut, and in Norwich, Connecticut, Arnold's hometown, and also Arnold's base when he was a young merchant, and said, what do you remember about this guy? Well, he got a lollapalooza of stories about young Benedict Arnold. There's no real evidence any of these stories are true, but even in modern biographies of Arnold, you can find them in various ways. Well, let me give you some examples. One of the stories about Arnold is this ruffian youth, nasty man, defiant of authority, was that as a little boy he liked destruction. And one day he climbed up a tree because he knew there was a nest of baby birds and he knew the mother was hovering nearby, and he went and he strangled all those baby birds to death just for the sheer pleasure of seeing that kind of destruction. No basis in fact for that story at all. Totally made up. Oh, there's another one. When Arnold was a young lad, and he would wait until the kids were walking to school in the morning, and he would go out and he'd break glass and he'd strew it all over the pathways so the little kids, apparently all barefooted, even though it was the middle of winter, I guess, would cut their feet up in the glass, and Arnold would cheer because he liked that sort of thing. At one point, he apparently tried to fire the village cannon with no one's authority, just because he was a little hellion. There's another story about him jumping up on a table during thunderstorms, and he'd shout and scream at the top of his lungs, like he was in league with Satan in some way. In fact, that's one of the stories about him, that he was a son of Satan because he tried to supposedly sell out the American cause. Well, these stories form the lore, but not the reality of the real Benedict Arnold. Several years ago, I became interested in his story, partially because, just as I learned as a laddie, that Washington couldn't tell lies and was a man of great virtue, and I greatly admire Washington. I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I learned that Arnold was like a Judas character. He was selling out everybody and everything. And I thought that was an interesting research topic because that's what I am. I'm a historian, and I believe all good research, all good history begins in the archives, actually going to the documents themselves. And that's where I found these letters making up the stories about Arnold's childhood, and that's also where I found information that pertained to Arnold's childhood. And I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the real childhood of Benedict Arnold. First of all, he was born in Norwich, Connecticut in January of 1741. He grew up in a family that was prospering. He was the fifth Benedict of the line. His father, Benedict IV, had started life as basically a barrel maker, as a cooper, but had worked his way out of that and had become a successful trading merchant, trading into the West Indies. And so the family was prospering in Norwich during the 1740s. And then something happened. Something went wrong. In the early 1750s, a disease, an epidemic, swept over New England and swept over the Norwich community. From what we can tell today from the descriptions, it was a diphtheria epidemic. And that's a kind of a disease where your throat will get clogged up. It's almost like a scale grows in your throat, and you will suffocate, ultimately, if that scaling is not broken in some way. Well, what happened? This disease hit the Arnold family. Two of his sisters died. His father almost died. Arnold was away at school at this particular time, and his mother was writing him letters, "Be prepared at any time. The Lord might decide to strike you down." She was a hard Calvinist in her thinking. The Lord is arbitrary. He has taken your sisters, he almost took your father, and he'll take you if he wants to. And the point about this story is that, and it's not the only one I can point to, but the point about it is that Arnold learned very early in life about arbitrary power. In this case, it was the way his mother presented the Lord to him. It was the loss of his sisters, the almost losing his father. And then something happened because his father begins to develop, after this tragedy, a drinking problem. And so by the late 1750s, he's losing his business, he's losing his way. He's become a confirmed, I guess what we call alcoholic, and ultimately his father will die of chronic alcoholism. And it's a very, very sad story because this once prosperous family begins to lose its way. And what Arnold sees is more arbitrary power in the community, because when his father developed that problem, the drinking problem, there was talk in the community that he should be thrown out of the church that they belonged to, what we would today call excommunication. Now, what happened in that case, the pastor in the community actually saved the father, and he backed off those who said, this man is an embarrassment to the community. He said, let's just let well enough alone. Let everything work out as it does. So the Arnolds were not thrown out of the church, but at the same time, they were subject to what almost appeared like arbitrary authority. Remember that, because it's going to play into the theme of the Revolution, because what do the Americans argue about the British? That they are being subjected to, what else? Arbitrary authority, tyranny on the part of Parliament, and then King George III. That's part of the story. Another part of the story that I'd like to share with you about his youth is that Arnold, coming out of a prosperous family, was actually tracked. He was going to school so that he could become a learned gentleman, perhaps even a minister. He was being prepared to go to Yale College. Now, in the 18th century, to go to college, you were the rarest of the rare. It's highly unlikely. Mostly 0.000 portion of 1% of the people would go to college. Very different from today. Highly unusual. He's being tracked to go to Yale. But then he will be brought home from the schools, and rather than going to Yale, he will be apprenticed. He'll be apprenticed. Why? Because the family has lost its way financially, and he will then be apprenticed to Daniel and Joshua Lathrop, the Lathrop brothers, living in Norwich. They were cousins of his mother Hannah, and he will be trained to be an apothecary merchant. That will be his training. And ultimately, he will be set up in business by the Lathrop brothers, not by going to Yale, but actually by moving to New Haven, where Yale is located, and he will begin to set up an apothecary shop. It will develop into a general merchandise store. Individuals can come and read and buy books there. And ultimately, Arnold will expand his own business interests as a young man in his 20s and will get involved in the West Indies trade. That is, trading with British and French and Dutch islands in the West Indies in various kinds of commerce, hauling goods out of New England into the West Indies. Sometimes he traded up into Canada. And he becomes, by a description in 1774, at this point, just a little over 30 years of age, he is described as the most credit-worthy merchant in New Haven. He's building a beautiful new home. He has succeeded financially, but something happened along the way, and that is during the 1760s and the 1770s, all of this agitation with the British begins to develop. After the French and Indian War, and what will happen is Arnold will get caught up in that agitation, and as a trading merchant, he resents the restrictions that British policymakers are putting upon American commerce. There's a duty on molasses. He doesn't want to pay it. There's a duty on various other kinds of trading goods that he's involved in, and he doesn't want to pay those duties. He doesn't like the Stamp Act of 1765, which was a general tax on all sorts of various kinds of goods. He resents the Townshend duties of 1767 on various trade goods. And he will begin to speak out. It will become a leader in the New Haven community, almost like a popular leader in trying to get people to agitate to oppose these British policies, which ultimately most of them will be removed. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is this notion of arbitrary power does carry over from his childhood. It carries into and it's translated into his perception of what's wrong with the British Empire and the position of the Americans in the British Empire in the 1760s and the 1770s. Okay, there's one more thing about his childhood. His father had brought this family back from relative obscurity. The first Benedict Arnold in America, going back to the 1630s and the 1640s, ended up being the governor of Rhode Island. But the family begins a descent through time. Property is subdivided. Various Benedicts in the future don't do well, and so the family is on the financial skids until Arnold's father, Benedict IV, turns that all around before he loses his way because of alcohol. But in the process, his father, in raising Benedict, taught him to have great pride in the Arnold name. He encouraged him to become like his great-great-grandfather, Benedict I, to become a person of consequence. in the process of being sensitive to the Arnold name, to not let people insult your name. You too must be a gentleman. You must be a person of virtue. You must be of service. But you must also respect, in return for that service, that people will respect you in turn. And that's going to be a very, very important part of the story of Benedict Arnold. Because he's not going to compromise with people who, as I guess I could say, would mess around with his name. For instance, in one of his trading adventures into the West Indies, he fought a duel with another trader. This particular trader insulted Arnold because Arnold wouldn't attend some social occasion. And he called his name into question. Arnold called him out, and in the custom of the day, dueling is part of the gentleman's custom. If you're insulted, you can invite someone to duel it out with you, literally to the death. It's a very elaborate process, and it's more commonplace than perhaps we realize going on among gentlemen in the 18th century. And so he didn't mess with Arnold's name. And so these are key characteristics: the matter of honor, the matter of arbitrary power, and let me add one more. It goes back to these so-called Arnold tales. In the 1770s, someone, a well-known individual who was in the Continental Congress, Dr. Benjamin Rush, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And Benjamin Rush said, "Tell me about your childhood." It's about the only recorded specific comment we have where Arnold actually talked about his childhood. And he said, well, there really wasn't much to it. And he said, basically, I would describe myself as a coward until my middle teenage years, 15 or 16, and then I had to become a man. And what he was really saying was, I wasn't doing the cannon stuff. I wasn't spreading glass. I was just an ordinary kid. And when my father lost his way, I had to step up. I was the surviving son, and there was one surviving daughter. I was the surviving son. I, in essence, had to become the head of the household. And that's what I went off, and that's when I went to the Layford Brothers. That's when I became a businessman. And that's when I had to get over my cowardice as an individual and stand up for myself, stand up for my name, and stand up against arbitrary power. My father's downfall forced me into the process of growing up and becoming an adult. That's what the historical record says. So I'm trying to compare that, obviously, with these various tales about Arnold in his dissolute youth, if I can put it that way. In fact, those tales, if you look at it this way, are backward through the prism of treason. Well, we need to explain what happened here, so obviously he had character flaws. But in reality, we don't live our lives backward. We actually live them, amazingly enough, forward. I know what happened yesterday. I know what's going on now, but I can't be sure what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day. The same is true for every living human being. Arnold had no idea that he would turn against the American cause in 1780 when he was growing up in the 1740s and the 1750s. In fact, it's fair to say that by the 1770s, before 1775 in Lexington and Concord, Benedict Arnold was a thoroughgoing advocate of American rights opposed to perceived arbitrary power on the part of the British Parliament and ultimately George III. For instance, he was on a trading mission to the West Indies in 1770 at the time of the so-called Boston Massacre. And when he heard about this, he wrote an amazing letter to this effect: "Good God, are my countrymen all, let me put it this way, a bunch of wimps that they won't stand up to the British? What's the matter with them? They have to stand up to this kind of tyranny." In this case, where British soldiers, being provoked, shot into an American crowd in Boston. Those weren't compromising words. By 1774, Benedict Arnold had decided to help organize, because of all the building agitation in reaction to various British policies, he decided to organize his own militia company in New Haven, which in early 1775 was recognized by the Connecticut government as the Second Company of Foot Guards. He will organize this company. He will recruit the individuals into the company. He will pay for the uniforms that those individuals will wear. And he will then be, hardly surprisingly, elected as their captain. And this company is ready to go and fight the British, just waiting for that opportunity once we've had the shootout at Lexington and Concord on the 19th of April of 1775. The word reached New Haven about Lexington and Concord about 3 days later. Arnold will quickly activate his company, and he will then order that company, and those individuals making up the company, a few, by the way, Yale students were included in his company. They will march off to entrap the British, to help entrap the British forces in Boston. But before they marched off, they needed something, needed weapons. They didn't really have a lot of muskets and other kind of weapons, and those weapons were available in a powder magazine in the community. But the town leaders don't want to turn the weapons over to Arnold, and he will go in and he will threaten them, the town fathers, in a meeting and say, turn them over or we will tear the place down to get at the weapons. We must defend American rights. So basically, he intimidated these folks, and they went and opened the powder magazine, and so Arnold's troops were then supplied with muskets, with powder, with ball, the basic accoutrements of a foot soldier at this time, and they marched off to the area of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that's where forces are assembling by the hundreds and the thousands, up to about 15,000, in the wake of Lexington and Concord. The British had come out on the 19th of April. They had failed. They had been driven back in to Boston, and you have about 3,000 British troops basically trapped in Boston, the peninsula of Boston, the city of Boston, and the Americans are surrounding them on the outside. Arnold is part of that, enthusiastically so. And what he is going to do when he gets into the Cambridge area across from Boston, he's going to seek out an acquaintance by the name of Joseph Warren. Warren's actually a fairly famous revolutionary leader. He will go on to die within a few months at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Arnold said, you know, I'm aware that this force is going to need significant weaponry, ordnance pieces, cannons, artillery. And I know where it is. And I know where we can get it. And Warren was very interested in this because of Arnold's trading into Canada. He was aware that way out west, about 250 to 300 miles, at the lower end of Lake Champlain, you have Fort Ticonderoga, a major British installation, at this point pretty much run down. And there's also Crown Point about 12 miles to the north, at one time another major British installation. And Arnold knows there are lots of artillery pieces out there. What we need to do is go out and get them and bring them, because if we're going to really drive the British out of Boston, you're going to need heavy ordnance, heavy weapons, cannons. And so Warren will then in turn make arrangements for Arnold to be commissioned a colonel in the Massachusetts forces. This is a very interesting kind of a story, especially because at this point in time, except for organizing a militia unit, Arnold has fundamentally no, zero, nada, none, no military experience. He's gone from being a captain of militia with no experience, well, they go out and parade around and go through the manual of arms and try to impress the people in the community that they were ready for combat and all that sort of thing. But he had no experience. So this is the beginning of the career of what I have described in one article as a natural military genius. Well, we don't usually think of Arnold in those terms, but that's what he was. He will then go west, and he will link up, not to his pleasure, with an individual by the name of Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen is the leader of the Green Mountain Boys in Vermont. They too know about those weapons, and they also know that if they take Fort Ticonderoga, there's lots of easy plunder. And so Arnold shows up. He doesn't yet have any troops behind him. He confronts Ethan Allen. The boys say, we don't want to have anything to do with Arnold, but what did Arnold have? He had a commission. He had a commission from the folks back in Massachusetts. So Allen said, well, we'll make you the co-leader. And so early on the morning of May 10th, it's actually under dark. It's still dark outside. Arnold will cross with about 80 of the boys with Ethan Allen, and they will quickly take Fort Ticonderoga and the contents therein. Now, Arnold's concerned about the artillery, but I hate to say this, but the boys had other interests. Like one of their interests, they had heard there was an ample supply of rum in the fort. There actually was about 90 gallons. And those boys knew how to drink rum. And they got drunk, roaring drunk, to the point where a couple of them tried to shoot Arnold. Either the guns misfired or they were so drunk they couldn't hit him. And so here's Arnold. He's trying to capture this fort for the purpose of getting that weaponry. Well, the boys are sort of interested in plunder, and they'll drift away in the next few days. And they'll go back to the Vermont territory. But Arnold's there, and he's really in command. He'll build his force, and he will be the key person in making that force available. Now, let me tell you a little story about this. Ethan Allen wanted the credit for taking Fort Ticonderoga. He, like Arnold, is an ambitious guy. And so what he will do, once the fort is taken, he will send an emissary, a guy by the name of John Brown. He'll send him all the way to Philadelphia to report to the Second Continental Congress, now meeting in Philadelphia. Actually started on May 10th, the selfsame day. And he's to report about the glorious triumph of taking Fort Ticonderoga from the British. And so Brown shows up. Starts into a spiel before Congress. And the congressmen are very nervous at this point because they're not thinking about independence. They don't want to do anything to offend King George III. They're hoping to reconcile differences with the British Crown. They say, what? You took Fort Ticonderoga? You didn't have any authority to do that. And so Brown does this backward kind of thing. And he said, well, you know, what I really meant was this madman Benedict Arnold took Fort Ticonderoga. Can you believe it? The beginning of Arnold's suspicious reputation is planted right there in 1775 at the Continental Congress. There are so many stories like this I could tell you. I don't know which ones to eliminate and which ones to keep, but the point is, Arnold already is developing a suspicious reputation. And what ultimately will happen in the Ticonderoga area is that Massachusetts and Connecticut will basically come to an agreement that Connecticut should pay for the forces, not Massachusetts. That is, pay for the forces in the Ticonderoga area. And so Connecticut will send their own head officer, their own colonel, Benjamin Hinman by name, to take over and to send Benedict Arnold home. Now here's the guy who really had made this a very important fort. Congress, by the way, has already backed off of its order about this notion about, you shouldn't have taken the fort, you should return the guns and all of that. That's all gone away. But Arnold is set home in shame, basically. But on the way home, back to New Haven, he'll meet with a man by the name of Philip Schuyler. Philip Schuyler has just been named a Major General in the Continental Army. He's in charge of the Army's Northern Department. And Schuyler knows that Arnold's done a good job at Ticonderoga, and he's sympathetic toward him. He said, "We need people of your talent and ability in our army. Maybe I can help you along the way." Arnold will thank them, and then he goes home to face the tragedy that his first wife, Margaret Mansfield, had died unexpectedly. And Arnold has 3 young sons at this point. So he's got a real dilemma now. Should I stay home, try to keep my mercantile business going, take care of my 3 sons, or should I turn that over to my beloved sister Hannah, the only other surviving child of his parents? She agrees to take charge of the children, and Arnold wants back into this war. He is determined to go after that arbitrary power. So Arnold, in August of 1775, will make his way to Cambridge. And at Cambridge, he's going to meet a fairly well-known fellow by the name of George Washington, who is now the commander-in-chief, having been named back in June by the Continental Congress. George Washington will meet with Arnold, and he likes him. He sees that this is a man who has a clear vision. And Arnold's talking about the importance of Canada in relation to British strategy. And so let me then just talk about British strategy as it's going to develop for just a minute. In 1775, it's clear to Arnold and others, and even Washington, that the British are going to try to retake New England. That New England is the center of the rebellion at this point. It's only spreading southward at a very slow rate into the other colonies. British strategy as it will evolve into 1776 and 1777, you move British and Hessian forces into Canada. You take the port of New York City to the south, 350 miles south of Montreal. You move one force out of Canada to Albany. You move another force up the Hudson River to Albany. They meet. They will sweep eastward into New England. You knock out the rebels in New England. You use the British Navy to sort of soften up points like Boston and other coastal towns, and that's how you end the rebellion. Arnold has already written to Congress and said, this is what the British are going to do. We need this territory. We need to be thinking about Quebec province as a 14th colony in rebellion. In fact, Arnold said, if you can't get anybody else, I'll be glad to lead the forces into Canada. Again, no military experience. And so what will happen is Washington will ultimately, on the advice of Schuyler, will select Arnold to lead one of 2 detached forces marching into Canada in the fall of 1775 to take Montreal and Quebec and to claim Quebec province as the 14th colony in rebellion. The story of Arnold's march to Quebec is a most harrowing kind of a story. He will organize a force with the help of Washington of about 1,100. Only about 500 to 600 of them will actually get through the Maine wilderness. They march through the Maine wilderness. They march up into the area of the Chaudière River. They head for Quebec. The estimate was it would take them 6 weeks to get there. The estimate was it would take them 3 weeks to get there. It took them 6 weeks to get there. Along the way, soldiers, some are starving to death. It's a very, very harrowing experience, but Arnold will make the breakthrough to the Plains of Abraham outside the walled city of Quebec in the middle of November of 1775. Meantime, the other force, under a General Richard Montgomery, a former British captain, will capture Montreal, will come will link up with Arnold outside of Quebec City. And now we've captured Montreal, we got to take Quebec. We take Quebec. We have captured this colony. We'll bring it in as the 14th colony in rebellion. Well, it doesn't work out very well in the end. One of the problems is that those American troops that had made it in the march to Canada had limited terms of service, and their service terms were up at the end of 1775. And so that army was going to begin to disappear, moving back into New Under the first day of 1776. So under the cover of a driving snowstorm and on the cover of a driving snowstorm on the last day, December 31st of 1775, Montgomery and Arnold try to take Quebec City. It is a disaster. The force under Montgomery is driven back by cannon fire. They try to go in through the lower town to make it into the upper town. Montgomery's force is driven backward. Montgomery is killed by cannon fire. He's out of it. Arnold's detachment, coming in from another point into the lower town to sweep into the upper town to capture the city, they really hardly get beyond the first barrier. Arnold didn't get beyond the first barrier. These barriers that were built to block the streets, to stop the Americans from invading the city. A ricocheting musket ball drives into the calf of Arnold's left leg. He's bleeding profusely, and the decision will be made against his will to take him back into the field where a temporary hospital has been set up in order to save his life. A very good warrior by the name of Daniel Morgan would take over, but he too would be captured that particular morning. The whole thing's a disaster. More than half the force is captured. Montgomery's dead, Arnold's seriously wounded, and Canada, in this case Quebec province, is not taken. What do? Arnold does the best he can. He says, my assignment has really become, and I'm quoting, making brick without straw. And during the winter and into the spring of 1776, he, amazingly enough, will keep up a light siege of the walled city of Quebec. And the governor, Guy Carleton's a smart guy. He's not going to come out and challenge Arnold just in case Arnold does have the resources to defeat him. And so the British maintain the city. Arnold's stuck on the outside. Ultimately, Arnold will be recalled by an individual general by the name of David Worcester, an old friend of sorts from his days in New Haven. Arnold has to pull back, and it's the beginning of a major retreat out of Canada, a very, very sad and destructive story for the Americans, because the British forces start to reach and to relieve Quebec in May of 1776, and by the end of June of 1776, the American forces in Canada have been driven all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. A disaster. Arnold did the best he could to make a stand, but there weren't enough straw wasn't there to make the bricks come together, and he's out. Now at this point, this man with no military experience has gained quite a bit, but his career will take on an unusual twist, but because of his mariner skills. Remember, he became a merchant trader. He would actually captain vessels into the West Indies before the war, captain vessels up into Canada for trade. And so Schuyler will ask him to take charge of a fleet of vessels then being built, and that fleet will defend the northern end of Lake Champlain to stop the British force coming out of Canada under Governor Guy Carleton. And this sets up an incredible confrontation on sea, where Arnold becomes the commodore of the American fleet, 16 small vessels standing up against superior British force coming out of Canada, superior British naval power. And during October of 1776, Arnold is a naval captain. He's already become a general in the Continental Army, a brigadier general. Now he's fighting on sea, and he will be involved in one of the most amazing delaying actions that you can possibly conceive on that lake. What? Fighting for the American cause. October 11th of 1776, the Battle of Valcour Island. He simply outsmarts the British. He maneuvers his vessels in such a way the British can attack into the wind successfully. During the day, his fleet takes a beating, and the British are almost in command. But then that night, Arnold finds a way to sneak his vessels that are still floatable around the British fleet, and there's a chase. Actually, when you go on Lake Champlain, since it drains north into Canada, the chase is up the lake toward Fort Ticonderoga. And Arnold knows, because he's in touch with the commander, Horatio Gates, at Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold knows that if he lets the British get to Ticonderoga, even though there's a great number of American troops there, they're short on powder and ball, they don't have enough weapons to defend the fort successfully. By the way, the cannons have already been dragged east to Washington's army. And so he's got to fight this amazing delaying action. I am convinced on October 13th, off of Split Rock on Lake Champlain, one of the most dramatic 2 hours of the whole Revolutionary War, Arnold, one vessel, trying to defend the rest of the surviving fleet so they can scurry for ground point and try to reach Fort Ticonderoga, will fight off up to 5 British naval vessels circling around him, blowing his vessel to smithereens. He never backed off. Well, it's really interesting because we're not talking about a man at this point who was lacking in courage, to say the least. We're talking about an individual who didn't know when to quit in many ways. He is unbelievable in battle. And this is true over and over again. He will finally sweep in to a little inlet. He'll help his crew get off the vessels. A couple of the other smaller vessels follow him. They burn everything. They get back to Fort Ticonderoga. And in the process, they convince Carleton, it's now the middle of October, that he can't go ahead with the campaign and take out Ticonderoga. It's too late in the season to take out Ticonderoga, to get another 50, 60 miles south to Albany. It's too late. And what does he do? Because of this demonstration of force on the part of Benedict Arnold, no longer a coward, I might add, fighting for the Americans, Carleton pulled back into Canada and waited for the next campaign season, which we'll talk about in just a moment. This is incredible. Now let me tell you one other thing. While Arnold is doing this, while he's out on the lake defending against a major British assault into the colonies, people are bad-mouthing him in Congress. After he loses the fleet, one American general, I think clearly jealous of Arnold, would say, "What did he do? He destroyed the fleet. What kind of nonsense is that?" Oh, you forgot to mention that he may have saved the cause, because that's what most naval historians conclude about Valcour Island and Split Rock. By delaying the British, he really helped save the cause to keep it going. Oh, there was another person bad-mouthing him in Congress about some petty dispute. And one of the congressmen sent a letter to Arnold that he received while he's on Lake Champlain. He's not in Philadelphia. He's on Lake Champlain. And to quote from the letter, this congressman wrote Arnold, and he said, "Your best friends are not your countrymen." In other words, they're here bad-mouthing you. I just wanted to make you aware of that. Samuel Chase of Maryland sent him that letter. Amazing. Arnold's still fighting for the Americans. Well, now let's jump ahead very quickly into the 1777 campaign. The British delayed. John Burgoyne now takes charge. Carleton is to stay in Canada. Burgoyne will move a force of 8,000 up to Lake Champlain, will take Ticonderoga. The Americans are backing up, backing up, backing up. They back all the way up to the Hudson River, On the west side of the Hudson River, they will form a line of defense on what is called Bemis Heights, the area generally known as Saratoga. Now, Arnold shouldn't have been there because the Continental Congress has issued the ultimate insult to him back in February of 1777. At that point, Arnold is a senior brigadier in the Continental Army. He is also clearly, by far and away, Washington would say this, the best general he has. He's Washington's fighting general. The problem was that Congress is in a log roll. Well, we need more generals from Pennsylvania and another one from Delaware and so on and so forth. So they passed over Arnold for promotion and promoted 5 guys who in the end, sum total, don't contribute a lot to the American cause, over Arnold. This is the ultimate insult for Arnold. He's fought, he's bled, he's been wounded, and what has he done now? What has happened to him now? And that is, he's been passed over for promotion. It's an involved story, but he goes to Congress and he will literally, after hoping he can reconcile his differences, they will restore his rank, his seniority. Ultimately, he puts his resignation on the table and said, I'm done. At that very moment, within a day or two, in July of 1777, George Washington sends a letter. I need a fighting general up in New York. The British are invading. They've taken Fort Ticonderoga. My guy, can you somehow get Benedict Arnold up here? And so Arnold reneges on his resignation, and he will go to Saratoga, and with Washington's authority, he will then become the true hero of Saratoga. The general in charge at that point is a man by the name of Horatio Gates. I've mentioned him before. Arnold got along with him in 1776, but Gates and Arnold were not getting along in 1777, primarily because Gates was concerned that Washington favored Arnold over him. Again, another long and involved story. And Gates is really not very happy that Arnold's there. Arnold's in charge of the left wing. He's the second in command at Saratoga. And he and Gates start to have disputes and problems. On September 19th, the British advance, like in a reconnaissance in force, into that American line on Bemis Heights. Gates wants to stay back. Americans can't really fight unless they're in a fixed position, he says. So, we're not going to go out and face them. Arnold said if you do that, they'll sweep right through the American line. They'll drive us into the Hudson River. We must go and face them. Washington will relent and let Arnold go out and do a little bit of the fighting that day. And in the process, Arnold will actually hold his own and actually be beating the British. When he comes back and he asks for further support, only about a third of the American army is engaged in this battle. He said, send more troops. We'll defeat them right now today. And rather than doing that, Gates reprimands Arnold for the fight and removes him from the field in the middle of the battle at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, the American forces are sort of, well, I don't want to say defeated. They have to retreat. The British have sort of a Pyrrhic victory in the sense that they control the battlefield. Sometimes this field is called Freeman's Farm. Now Gates and Arnold go at it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And what I can tell you is it's unpleasant. Gates will finally remove Arnold from command, confine him to quarters. The British, meantime, have to figure out how to get around the Americans, and time is passing. We're into early October. 7th of October, the British will send out another reconnaissance in force. Gates will finally agree to engage them. He will send out forces under Daniel Morgan. I mentioned him before in terms of the Canadian expedition. Definitely one of the top American fighters, no doubt about that. And it's sort of like a draw out in the fields. Arnold knows a battle is going on, and finally he knows, even though he has been suspended from command, relieved of command, he will go out and he'll try to lead the Americans to victory, and that's exactly what he did. on October 7th. Arnold will go out, he'll help rally the American troops, they will drive into the British line. At one point off to the left in what is called Bremen's redoubt, Arnold sees that that's a possible opening there. He will move to the left, he rides down a line, there are bullets, that is musket balls flying all around him. He leads the troops into this redoubt. In the process, he is shot off the horse that he is riding. The horse crashes down on him, dead, crashes down on the self-same leg that had been wounded at Quebec, for which Arnold was already doing some limping. Apparently, there was a musket ball also entered that leg. It destroyed his left leg. Arnold is writhing in pain on the battlefield. But the British line is broken, the retreat is begun. And on the 18th of October, Burgoyne will surrender. Great American victory. This great victory brings the French into the war openly on behalf of the Americans, providing the critical difference in troop strength and in fighting power, providing a navy, in supporting the Americans. We don't want to underrate the role of the French in helping to bring victory to the American War for Independence. Well, where's Arnold? Let me put it this way. On the 7th of October, Arnold is going to begin to be hauled off to a military hospital somewhat to the south in Albany. Gates, during the battle, the man that Congress will declare the hero of Saratoga, Congress will mint a medal to him, rarely given medal to Horatio Gates as the hero of Saratoga. Where was Gates? He was a half a mile behind the battlefield in his headquarters, having an argument with a wounded British officer about the merits of American independence. He wasn't even near the battlefield, the so-called hero of Saratoga. Arnold isn't in that great drawing of the surrender of Burgoyne because he was in a military hospital. He was there for the next 3 or 4 months trying to recover. At one point he told one of the doctors, if you try to saw off my leg, I'll kill you. You don't take my leg, no matter what. They then hooked up this kind of a box. They put the leg in a box, the shredded leg in a box. In the end, it doesn't ever heal correctly. Arnold will limp the rest of his life. He had to wear a special shoe because this leg is now 2 to 3 inches shorter than his right leg. He'll live on crutches and canes the rest of his life, all given to the American cause. But trust me, at this point, he's begun to become disillusioned and even bitter. All those problems with Congress about his good name, his honor being passed over from command for a higher command, have begun to embitter him about, is this the cause? Is this what I gave myself for? Where they don't understand the fundamental principles of merit? Was it really that bad with the British? Maybe I overreacted. What happens is Congress doesn't have the guts. They've restored Arnold's major generalship or given him his major generalship because of an action that I've left out of the story before the Saratoga engagements. But they haven't restored his seniority. The question is, will Congress do that? Finally, they dump the assignment off on Washington. They don't have the courage to face Arnold, who's half dead in a military hospital. And so they tell Washington, we'll let him know that we've restored his seniority over those 5 other individuals as a testament to his good service. Now, we're going to go ahead and credit Gates with the victory because we like him and we're not sure about Arnold. Well, what was Arnold's reaction? Washington then, he's so busy, he's overwhelmed. Well, finally write Arnold and said, your seniority's back in January of 1778. The battles occurred in September and October. Washington gets around to it in January. What was Arnold's response? He waited 6 weeks before he wrote back to Washington in one of the most incredible letters in his life story that I've ever run across. He thanks the commander-in-chief for his solicitation. He thanks him for having supported him in the past, as Washington had done. Washington had told off, well, really not tell off, but it mildly suggested to a number of congressmen he made a mistake by passing over Arnold. He's the best I've got. I need his support, back a year before. But Arnold now does this. He writes the letter and he said, I just want you to know that, Your Excellency, well, I know you will do the very best for your cause, and you will find some way to bring your cause. Your is in this letter. Your cause, your involvement to a happy resolution for everyone. He didn't say to American victory. What did he just said? He said, it's not my cause, it's your cause. You have treated me, I've fought, I bled, I gave everything, I gave up my career. I am in the process of becoming a very poor person. I've given part of my fortune to the cause. We didn't go into that, but it's true. He's having his doubts, to say the least. And that's all going to come to a head as we now move into the final phase of Benedict Arnold's military career for the American cause of liberty. Well, what happened was, this is incredible in and of itself. Arnold first went home to New Haven. The man is almost broken physically. And then he decides, I'll go to Valley Forge and rejoin the Continental Army. And by the middle of May of 1778, he shows up in Valley Forge and he's greeted as a hero. Washington literally adores Arnold. And he also realizes Arnold is not fit for a field command. That's very important. Because what Washington is going to do, he is going to name Arnold the military governor of Philadelphia, because in June of 1778, the British pull out. They've taken Philadelphia. They use it as a winter quarter. They pull out of Philadelphia in June of 1778 back to New York. A lot of this had to do with the French coming into the war. We have to reconcentrate our forces not only in New York City but in other parts of the globe. And so Washington gives Arnold what is really just an assignment where I just go in and what I want you to do is mollify the people in the city. We don't want a lot of bloodshed. We don't want to be killing Tories. We just want to get everyone settled down again. That's your assignment. And the other part of the assignment, we want you to shut the city down for a week or more, whatever is necessary, and go through it. We'll send the troops in to back you up once the British are out of there to look for military supplies. The Continental Army is chronically short of military supplies, even though the French are helping them out. And so this was a very, very logical thing to do. Now, one thing I need to add, before Arnold went into Philadelphia as this military governor, as required by Congress, he signed a loyalty oath to the Congress. And May 30th of 1778 was required of all of the officers of the Continental Army. And he said, okay, I'm loyal. That's the way it is. I think maybe at that point he was still, even though he had his doubts, I think he was still loyal at that point when he signed that paper, witnessed by General Henry Knox, Chief of Artillery of the Continental Army. And then Arnold went off to Philadelphia. The point now is Arnold arrives and he is not welcomed by the local radical leaders. Among them, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Reed. Reed is one of the leaders of the Pennsylvania government, and they don't want some military guy coming in there and telling them that they can't go ahead and hang a few loyalists and seize property of those we suspected of being fellow travelers with the British. And Arnold is blocking all of that. That's his job. That's his assignment. Those are his orders. So Arnold will begin to get into a tussle with Joseph Reed and Reed's followers in Philadelphia. And remember, Arnold's not a back-off kind of guy. He is confrontational. But he is not, while he may have been, as I've tried to point out to you, a natural military genius in combat. On land and on sea, as it turns out, he is really not a very effective politician. In fact, he's a non-politician. He doesn't have the right kind of personality. He's too confrontational. And when Reed and company come after him, he's willing to stand up to them. And then the whole thing begins to break down over a matter of Arnold's looking for a new wife, of all the things. Early on, Arnold has contact with the Shippen family. The Shippens are described as loyalists, probably more neutralist than loyalist. And one of the daughters is Peggy Shippen. At this point, about 18 years of age. Arnold's well into his mid-30s at this point. He's a wounded war hero. And he and Peggy first become friends and associates. And then Arnold finally will ask he will ask Peggy whether she will marry him. And actually he goes to Peggy's father and he reluctantly approves. He says, "This is a bit of a mismatch here. You're twice as old as my daughter, but I know that she loves you and she respects you." Now Joseph Reed in turn says, "Aha, see, he's really siding with the loyalists." And so he and his friends will come up with a series of 8 charges. We can't go into that detail, about how Arnold was abusing his power and authority in a whole variety of ways. And that is published in the local papers, that list, at the very time that Arnold is getting ready to marry Peggy. This again is the ultimate insult. This is an ultimate insult. This is an attack on Arnold's honor, his reputation. And like I suggested early on, you didn't want to mess with Arnold's reputation. True of most people, actually, at that time. A very, very sensitive matter. Probably even true in our own time today. So Arnold is being bedeviled by these people. He will go to Congress, he'll go to Washington, he demands a court-martial to clear his name. And nothing really happens. In fact, Joseph Reed will go to Washington and say, "We're not prepared to deal with the charges we've made against Arnold. We haven't collected all our evidence yet. And I'll tell you what, if you don't like it, I'll tell you what we'll do. If you want to go ahead and proceed with the court-martial and see to the exoneration of Arnold," which I think Washington would have done, "we will not allow our militia to become a part of the Continental Army this year." That's a fairly significant threat because Washington needed all the troop strength he could get. So Washington will agree, and this court-martial is delayed and delayed and delayed, delayed all the way into September. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong date there. It's delayed all the way into January of 1781. That's a long delay. Arnold resigns as commander. He becomes convulsed by this. "I must restore my reputation." He doesn't know that Washington isn't supporting him, that Congress is indifferent to his needs. But he does know something else, and that is he knows how to get a hold of the British. Now, this involves Peggy Shippen. One of the really disputed points is, what was the role of Peggy Shippen in Arnold's treason? What I can tell you is she knew what was going on. She was not the primary mover. She didn't whisper in Arnold's ear one day and say, "Oh, Benny, please, for the sake of our marriage, join the British." That's utter nonsense. Even though there are books written about that, there have been 2 or 3 in the last few years that seem to have that line of thinking. The evidence doesn't support that. Arnold has been building to this moment when he has become totally dissatisfied with the revolutionary cause, And if it's going to be the Joseph Reeds of the world who are in charge, he doesn't want to be a part of it, and he will begin the process of contacting the British. This is a very slow process, ebbing back and forth, back and forth. At times Arnold's in, at times Arnold's out. And then, once Arnold is convicted in that court-martial, there are 8 charges, 2 of them. One using public wagons to move some goods for his own good purpose and not paying for them. One allowing a vessel that he had invested in to leave Philadelphia when the port was closed when he moved in as the military governor. Washington is then directed by Congress to reprimand Arnold. And this reprimand, Washington doesn't do it to his face. He's trying to hold down on it. First of all, he issues the reprimand in general orders of the day. Yes, it's being read, but he's trying to hold down on the embarrassment to Arnold. But the second, what Washington does is very shortly thereafter, he almost apologizes to Arnold, not knowing that Arnold is communicating with the British, and said, I respect you as a military man. I will offer you the left wing. You will be my number 2 guy in the Continental Army. And what does Arnold do? He turns him down. Because with that embarrassment, with that insult, with that attack on his honor, who now is the source of arbitrary power in Arnold's life? Right? Is it Joseph Reed? Is it the radical leadership in Philadelphia? Is it the Continental Congress? Is it even George Washington? Mix honor and arbitrary power together and you come up with a formula that begins, not completely, but begins to explain his going over to the British. Arnold will say, no, I won't take that. I'm still recovering from my wounds. Why don't you give me a post like West Point? And it's going to be at West Point, because Washington concedes and gives him the command, that Arnold will begin to negotiate. He already is in negotiations with Major John Andre, who's sort of in charge of British espionage. And that story is very long and involved, but Arnold will actually meet secretly with Andre. Andre will be captured. All of the incriminating documents that Arnold has prepared about the weaknesses at West Point will be ultimately turned over to Washington. Arnold knows if he doesn't get out of town, and he's resident across the river from West Point at the Beverly Robinson home at this time, and this is September 25th of 1780, he will flee down the river, and he will then renounce the American cause. And in one of those incredibly curious documents, he wrote a letter that evening. Number one, he exonerated Peggy, saying she wasn't the real reason for this. She's just been my good and faithful wife. But he also says, I don't expect the world to understand what I have done. But I believe it's the right action, because what Arnold is saying is, again, this comes through in his thinking and his correspondence. What he is saying is, the American cause has not lived up to its ideals. I am an example of its not living up to its ideals. I believe the cause has betrayed me, and I am going to restore my allegiance. In his mind, he is not committing treason. In his mind, he committed treason back in 1775 when he turned against the British and the British government. He is restoring that link to the British. And that's the way he looked at it. And so Arnold, tragically, I guess, from our point of view, goes back over to the British. He will try to help them in a variety of ways to, how do we put it, somehow find a way to win the war, but it's gone all downhill for the British at this point. There'll be this major recovery for the Americans in 1781. And a whole British army will be captured at Yorktown, that army under Charles Lord Cornwallis, and that's the beginning of the end of the war for American independence, and ultimately American victory with inestimable help from the French. So I guess we can say Arnold guessed wrong. He got caught up in the details of the moment. One of the questions is, did he not like the French? I've read that about him. Well, the French didn't seem to bother him until someone wrote a document in his name saying, trying to convince the Americans to give up the cause after Arnold went over to the British, saying, do you really want to be allies of the French, our traditional enemies? Arnold never really raised that issue until after he went back over to the British. And whether he raised it or some surrogate writing a propaganda piece to try to convince the Americans to come back to the British fold, I can't tell you. The other one is Arnold had a character flaw. The character flaws go back to that childhood that I briefly described for you. He was vain. He was power hungry. He was greedy. He was born of the seed of the serpent. On and on and on. As one contemporary said after learning of his apostasy, he's nothing more than a mean toad eater. He's a total embarrassment to the American cause. Very, very interesting. Was there a character flaw? I don't agree with that. I think it's an easy explanation. It's one of those when you look backward through time. Oh, we can find something in his youth that set up his adulthood. Actually, what you find is a man who lived and was one of the greatest assets by far to the American cause, until in his mind that cause turned against him. And then he in turn turned against that cause and tried to destroy it so that there would be a realignment within the British Empire between the colonists and those other subjects in the British Empire. It's an amazing story with twists and turns. It's not a simple story to understand. In many ways, it's a very enlightening story about the human condition, and it's also equally, while there's a heroic figure involved for part of the story, it is also a tragedy in terms of the life of Benedict Arnold. Well, Arnold remained in America until the latter part of 1781. He did engage for the British in a couple of not terribly successful campaigns, and he will then go off with Peggy to England. They'll also resettle. They do get land in Canada. And in the end, he'll live out his life in many ways a broken man health-wise because of all of the beating he had taken during the Revolutionary War and all of those wounds. They ultimately caught up with him, and he will pass away on June 14th of 1801, just 60 years old. Note that we celebrate June 14th as Flag Day in this country. It is also the death day of Benedict Arnold. Perhaps some irony in that is the June 14th. And he will be buried in a church, St. Mary's at Battersea, along with Peggy, who will die 3 years after him, along with a daughter who died later, Sophia. And their bones are mingled together today underneath that church, underneath the basement in that church. And in that church in the basement, there's a memorial stone to Arnold. And upstairs in the sanctuary, there's actually a beautiful stained glass window dedicated to Benedict Arnold. And the theme of that, actually provided by an American in the 1950s, is the hope for complete restoration of good relations between Great Britain and the United States. And see, as Arnold is a person who could appreciate both sides. That's the message. Whether you agree with it or not, it is there. And so now you have the case of this really amazing individual who contributed so much, who was truly a revolutionary hero, a true natural military talent. And yet everything went downhill for him to the point where he saw no further merit in the American cause. And so he chose to go back over to the British, which we Americans call treason. And in the process, his name has come down to us as one of the greatest villains of all time. So that is the story of a great revolutionary hero who died a very notorious villain.